one of them is that in our culture nowadays, doubting everything is like a virtue. You know, people just have this mentality: question everything, doubt everything, right? Of course, they don't doubt everything. There are certain things, you know, that they hold or they cherish that they won't doubt. But typically, there's just a mentality of doubting, you know, everything about Western civilization or Christian values or Christian beliefs, or all of those things are just kind of open game. Is that people mistakenly believe that unless they can achieve 100% or absolute or total certainty about something, that there is therefore reason to doubt. Okay? So when it comes to the Christian faith, say the existence of God, okay? And somebody could construct some kind of scenario or give me some kind of logical explanation of why God doesn't exist, okay? And if I can't prove absolutely that God exists, then I am somehow warranted in doubting God's existence. That's a mistake, okay? That's not true. I don't have reason to doubt simply because I can't disprove somebody's so-called logical possibility that they've thrown out. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. Okay, so this is our last kind of introductory lesson. So next week we're going to get into the real meat of things. Our next module, our first module, is epistemology. Okay? So anybody know what epistemology is? You've heard the word, right?
You said we've heard something about studying to know how you know.
Okay, exactly. It's the study of knowledge. What is truth? What is knowledge? What is belief? What's the relationship between belief and knowledge? How do we know? Can we know? All those kind of questions. Okay, so those are obviously pretty fundamental questions to everything we're going to talk about over the next number of months. So we'll spend 3 weeks talking about the area of epistemology starting next week. But as I promised you last week, I want to do this lesson on doubt. I've never done this one before, but I've been thinking a lot and doing some reading and studying on doubt over the last year or so, and then I just suddenly asked myself, why haven't we talked about this before in an apologetics class? It just makes sense. So we're going to cover this. Incidentally, we are also in the Equipping You sessions on Sunday evenings. I'm going to be teaching the lessons, the first 4 lessons in October. And one of those, we're going to do a panel discussion on the subject of doubt. So we'll talk some about the things we're going to talk about today. We're going to go in much more depth today. But we're going to have a panel discussion of several guys up there, kind of a question and answer time with people about the whole subject of doubt. So that's coming, but that'll be a little bit different than what we're doing today. So when we think about doubt, in our culture there are kind of 2 kind of extremes that I think people fall into, kind of 2 ditches, if you will, that people can veer off into when it comes to the subject of doubt. And one of them is that in our culture nowadays, doubting everything is like a virtue. You know, people just have this mentality: question everything, doubt everything, right? Of course, they don't doubt everything. There are certain things, you know, that they hold or they cherish that they won't doubt. But typically, there's just a mentality of doubting everything about Western civilization or Christian values or Christian beliefs, or all of those things are just kind of open game. And the more you doubt, in some ways people think, the better you are, the smarter you are, the more honest you are if you're willing to doubt everything. On the other side, the other ditch that we can kind of veer off into is the tendency that we often have as Christians to think that if a Christian doubts, they're not a very good Christian. All right, so there's a real hesitancy oftentimes for us to talk about doubts if we have doubts, because we know that there's some people out there in our Christian circles who just look down on anybody who doubts and just thinks, well, that person, they must not be a very good Christian if they have doubts. And I think that those are both extremes that we need to avoid. We need to find the middle road. Doubt is not something that's to be, that's a virtue that we need to seek, but on the other hand, it's not necessarily indicative that there's some kind of significant problem in our Christian life. And you'll see, I think, why I say that as we go on. And as I mentioned last week, everybody doubts, at least at some point in their life. Everybody doubts. And I think even for mature Christians and Christians who have been around for a long time, occasionally doubts will come in their minds, right? So we know that Christians doubt. That's kind of the issue we're talking about. This is the issue we're dealing with today. That Christians doubt. But what we probably don't think about oftentimes is that non-Christians doubt too. And non-Christians doubt about the things that they believe, right? So I like this quote from Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel is an atheist philosopher. He's a philosopher of the mind. And he wrote a book I'm going to recommend here in a few weeks that I think is really good. But he makes, in another place, he makes this comment. He says, "I am talking about something much deeper, namely the fear of religion itself. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that." That's obviously a very interesting quote. I think sometimes people misunderstand what he's saying there. He's not saying the only reason he's an atheist is because he wants to be an atheist. Certainly Nagel is a very intelligent guy. He has intellectual reasons why he's an atheist. So he's not saying that he doesn't have intellectual reasons. But what strikes me about this quote, and here's a guy who's very intellectual, has thought through this thing very carefully, and yet he still has doubts. Now, we as Christians oftentimes are hesitant to talk about our doubts because we don't want people to think we're unsure. Unbelievers are the same way. So if you're talking to an unbeliever, they may come across very strong in their opinions. They may care like they really believe this stuff. But don't fall into the mistake of thinking they don't also struggle with doubts. Okay? So oftentimes we're making progress in their minds if we're just raising some doubts about what they believe, right? So everybody doubts. And one of the reasons that everybody doubts is because of what I call the problem of certainty, okay? And we'll go into this in much more detail in our epistemology section. But what we call full, or what philosophers or epistemologists call full or absolute certainty, is probably impossible to achieve, okay? With the possible exception of mathematics. So some epistemologists would argue that there are elements in mathematics that you can prove absolutely. Others would argue, well, no, because mathematics itself is based on certain philosophical ideas and opinions and that sort of thing. But once we come to the realization that absolute certainty is impossible in every area of our lives, including our religious beliefs, this actually can free us up quite a bit, right? So epistemologists make a distinction between what's called a logical possibility and what's called an epistemic possibility. Okay, again, epistemic has to do with knowledge or what we know, right? So there are a lot of things which you could make a logical argument for. You could construct a logical argument. You could say, well, if you have this scenario and this scenario and this scenario, then this would be true, okay? But you don't have any evidence for those things. So you really don't, even though it's logically possible it could be true, you don't really have any epistemic warrant. You don't have any real reason to believe it's true, even though it's logically possible to be true. So, for example, it might be logically possible that the whole Neil Armstrong landing on the moon thing was just staged by government, just to fool us, right? And there are actually people who believe that we never did land on the moon. It was all just staged by the government, right? And you can construct a scenario. You can say, well, you know the government lies to us sometimes. Well, of course, we all know that. And we know the government wants our money, and so maybe if they staged a moon landing, we'd be more willing to pay. So you could construct a scenario where, well, yeah, that's logically possible, but I don't have any evidence for that, right? I have no epistemic reasons, really, to believe that we didn't land on the moon. It was all just fabricated, right? Or somebody might say to you, I don't know how often you go to Walmart, but I just live right down the street from a Walmart, so I'm there every day. Even if I'm just driving by and have no reason to go in, my car just goes in there, right? So somebody might say to you, the Walmart you were at there yesterday, it no longer exists. It's just an empty shell of a building, Well, they could give me some scenarios where that would be true, some logical explanation why it's true, but the question is, do I have any reason to believe it's true, right? They may have logical reasons. It's a logical possibility, but it's not an epistemic possibility. It's really not. It's not probable, given the data and the evidence and the things that I actually know and have confidence that I know. The problem is that the line between a logical possibility and an epistemic possibility can get kind of blurred at times. And particularly it gets blurred because when people are trying to convince you of a logical possibility that you really don't believe, and they're trying to convince you of it, oftentimes they hit you with just all kinds of reasons to believe it, right? So, and we deal with this all the time in our society and in our culture, particularly with conspiracy theorists. So conspiracy theorists love to do this, and they'll construct the whole conspiracy and all the reasons why it's true, and every little thing they see is evidence that it's true, and they hit you with all these things, and after a while you start wondering, and you don't stop to think, wait a minute, I have absolutely no evidence for any of this, It's all just ad hoc hypotheses that people raise up, okay? So this problem of certainty, that you can't ever have absolute certainty, or certainty in which somebody could not give some kind of logical explanation to believe otherwise, okay? So that's what I'm saying. Absolute certainty is where somebody could not give you any kind of other logical explanation, all right? And what happens is that people mistakenly believe that unless they can achieve 100% or absolute or total certainty about something, that there is therefore reason to doubt. Okay, so when it comes to the Christian faith, say the existence of God, okay, and somebody could construct some kind of scenario or give me some kind of logical explanation why God doesn't exist, okay, and if I can't prove absolutely that God exists, then I am somehow warranted in doubting God's existence. That's a mistake, okay, that's not true. I don't have reason to doubt simply because I can't disprove somebody's so-called logical possibility that they've thrown out there. So I have no reason to doubt that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. I don't care how many times some guy says to me, well, the government had all these reasons, and and they were capable of doing it, and they manipulated the news media, and they give me all these things. I don't give them the time of day, right? I don't give them the time of day because just the fact that they can give me some kind of logical scenario, that doesn't mean that it has any merit. That doesn't mean that I should call into question my doubts. So the problem that comes with doubting, the reason so many times we doubt and people doubt, is because they mistakenly think that unless they have absolute certainty, they need to doubt, or they should doubt. And that's just simply a mistake. We'll explore that much more deeply and understand it much more clearly in our lessons on epistemology. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about doubt? And I like the way Gary Habermas puts it. Gary Habermas is an expert on the resurrection. He's a teacher at forget the name of the university in Virginia. Anyway, he's a leading expert on the subject of the resurrection, but he's also done a lot of work in the area of doubt. He's written a book about doubt, and he's counseled a lot of people on doubt. And he refers to doubt as being of two minds. And one of the reasons for that, and of course he's not the only one that defines it that way, one of the reasons for that is, for example, in James, where James talks about doubt in James chapter 1, he uses a Greek word, diakrinos, okay? And that idea of diakrinos, the idea of that is to hesitate between two ideas or between two opinions, okay? So doubt is this idea of there's two ideas, two opinions out there, and I'm somewhere in the middle. I haven't resolved one way or the other which one I believe. And so our own English word, of course, as many of our English words do, comes from the Latin. And the Latin word for doubt actually comes from an Aryan word that means two. Okay? So this whole idea of doubt conveys this idea of there are two options, there are two possibilities, and that I'm somewhere in the middle. So Os Guinness says, doubt is a state of mind in suspension between faith and unbelief, so that it is neither of them wholly, and it is each of them only partly. And in another place he says, to doubt is to waver between the two, to believe and doubt at once, and to be of two minds. So doubting is this idea of two minds, being caught between two possibilities or two ideas or two opinions. All right? So I think of it as kind of a no man's land, all right? So you have one belief over here, you have another belief over here, and you're somewhere caught in the middle, and you're not saying that this is false, but you're not really sure it's true because you've got this, and you're just kind of in this no man's land between the two. So a couple examples from Scripture. One classic example is the story of the father of the demon-possessed son. So after the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus and the three disciples come down and they encounter the other disciples, and they're caught up in this big controversy and uproar at the foot of the mountain or wherever they come down to, and the controversy is over this father's son who is demon possessed, right? And so when Jesus shows up, the father of the son goes to Jesus and he says, please help me if you can. And what does Jesus say? You remember? He says, if I can, all things are possible to him who believes, right? And then the father's response is, do you remember? Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, right? This is a classic example of somebody who's caught in that no man's land, right? He does believe. He came to Jesus because he believed. He'd heard all these reports that Jesus healed and he'd come to Jesus for that reason. But when he's finally there and his son is still, demon possessed, then there's the question, well, maybe he can't help me, right? And so he's torn between these two, and he pleads for God to help him with his unbelief. Another classic example is the Israelites. The story, you remember the story of the prophets of Baal, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and the contest between the two altars. And the prophets of Baal build their altar, and they try to call down fire, and that whole thing that goes on all day. And then Elijah has his altar built, and he pours water all over it, and the fire comes down out of heaven, right? But Elijah says something to the Israelites there before he demonstrates that God is God. He says to the Israelites, he says, "How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, serve Him, and if Baal is God, serve him." So the Israelites are caught in this no man's land between belief in God, belief in Yahweh, and belief in Baal. So those are just a couple examples of this condition of faith, of doubt. So several of the people I've read on doubt try to stress that doubt is not unbelief or disbelief, okay? So doubt is not overtly saying such and such isn't true. Doubt is being in this kind of middle ground where I'm just being torn between two ideas. I'm not saying it's not true, but there's this over here, so I'm not absolutely sure it is true, right? So the opposite of faith is unbelief, not doubt. Doubt is not the opposite of faith, but still doubt is not full faith, as Osgen has pointed out, right? Other thing about doubt that Bobby Conway, who's written a book, Doubting Toward Faith, points out. Doubt doesn't stay put. All right? So you get a doubt, you have a doubt in your mind, and the question is, what are you going to do with that doubt? And if you just leave the doubt there to fester, if the doubt's there, it's moving somewhere. It's moving you in your thinking. It's moving you somewhere. And so it can be moving you, and often does move us into a state of unbelief, right? So I'm not unbelieving X over here. I'm just not sure, but I've got this doubt, and this doubt just kind of hangs around and hangs around and hangs around, and eventually I move to the point where I now say, I don't know if this is true. I now say it's not true, okay? So it moves us to unbelief. But doubt can also move us to faith, okay? So when we have doubts in our minds and doubts in our hearts, if we deal with them properly, we can actually exploit our doubts to grow in faith, right? So when we think then about the Bible and what does the Bible actually say about doubt, I think about all the different people in the Bible who doubt. And when we talk about this question, well, can somebody doubt and still be a good Christian? Well, we have plenty of examples of men and women of God who struggled with doubt in the Bible, right? So you have Moses. So Moses, this is incredible. Moses is up on Mount Sinai. He sees the burning bush. So there's this bush that's burning but not consumed. And then he hears a voice out of the bush. It's God speaking to him, right? So he's experiencing a miracle, and he's hearing the voice of God. And then God says to him, I'm going to send you to Egypt, and I want you to lead my people out of Egypt. And Moses' response is what? Doubt. Even though he's in the process of experiencing a miracle. And he's doubting whether or not he has the wherewithal, the resources in himself to lead the people out of Israel. Or lead the people out of Egypt, right? And then there's Gideon. Gideon's a great example here, who God sends an angel, tells him, okay, I want you to do this, and Gideon goes, I don't think I can do this. To make sure you're really in this thing and you're really doing it, here's a test, so it's the fleece and the dew test, right? And he gives God a test, and God doesn't reprimand him, God doesn't rebuke him for it, the angel doesn't rebuke him. He says, okay, we'll do that. So he does it. And what does Gideon do the next day? Well, that might have been coincidence, right? How many times has God answered our prayers and we've gone, I wonder if that was just a coincidence or if God really answered my prayer, right? Well, that's what Gideon is doing, right? So he flips the test, right? So, okay, well, tonight let's do it the opposite just to make sure, right? I just think that's a classic example. And then there's Abraham, who in Hebrews it says he did not waver in unbelief, but that is from a certain point forward in his life, all right? But there was a point where God had told him a couple times, I'm going to give you this land, okay? I'm going to give you all this land. And then God comes to him again in Genesis 15 and says, I'm going to give you all this land. And Abraham says, how do I know you're going to give me all this land? Okay? And so he's wondering, he's kind of doubting, right? And so what God does in Genesis 15 is he enters into a covenant with Abraham. And at that point then, I think is the point at which Abraham then is completely satisfied and does not doubt again. And then, of course, we have numerous examples from the disciples. We have the example of the father of the demon-possessed boy. We have Zacharias, who again is in the middle of experiencing a miraculous supernatural encounter with an angel talking to him, and he doubts, right? When he's being told he's going to be the father of John the Baptist. And then, of course, John the Baptist himself, who at one point says, this is the Christ, basically. He says, this is the Son of God who's coming to take away the sins of the world. And then later he gets thrown in prison. He hears about all the things that Jesus is doing. And so he sends his disciples to Jesus to ask Jesus, are you the one, or should we wait for another? So here John the Baptist, who previously declared Christ to be the one sent from God, is now asking, are you the one sent from God? And then, of course, the classic we oftentimes think about is so-called doubting Thomas, which is kind of an unfair nomenclature for him because all the disciples doubted at various points, right? And in fact, it's not just in the Bible, but throughout Christian history, really influential, great Christians have suffered bouts of doubt, some of them their entire lives, okay? Martin Luther, he not only had a lot of doubts before he got saved, but after he got saved, he was obviously going through just one crisis after another throughout his life. And he had many opportunities to doubt, and did doubt, and struggled with doubt. I was thinking this morning about his great hymn, A Mighty Fortress is Our God, okay? And I just think that hymn had to have been written out of the experience of doubt, right? It's just, you just hear it in the hymn as somebody who has struggled with doubt and has fixed their eyes on God, who becomes his mighty fortress. Charles Spurgeon, called the Prince of Preachers. There are something like 50 volumes of Charles Spurgeon's sermons that you can get and read, and I don't know that I've ever picked up and read one of his sermons that I just wasn't tremendously edified by. This guy struggled with depression and doubt his entire life. He was preaching in the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London to thousands of people every week, every Sunday, and he went through tremendous times of doubt. Last February, we weren't able to go down to the Dallas Conference on Science and Faith because of the pandemic. But they streamed it live, and so they had all these various scientists talking, and so we streamed it here at the church. Several of us were here and participated in that. And at the end, they had a session in which they had all the various speakers all together, or all together on the screen, and people could submit their questions, text in their questions to these various speakers. And one of the questions that came up was, it was kind of just a general question to all the various speakers. There were about 5 of them, to all the various speakers. How does all this information, this scientific information that you have, how does this help you in your life? And it struck me that 2 or 3 of them talked about doubts that they have. And they talked about how when I have doubts, it helps me to go back to this scientific information, this scientific data that I have, that I've presented here in this. It helps me to go back to deal with that. And I was just encouraged to think, here are some guys, really knowledgeable guys, who still from time to time in their lives have doubts, and they have to figure out, how am I going to deal with this doubt? Michael Licona is another leading expert on the resurrection. He's written a major scholarly work on evidences for the resurrection, and he is a man who particularly earlier in his life dealt with doubt. But even from time to time, even now, I think he acknowledges that from time to time he has sessions of doubt. Sean McDowell, I don't know if you know Sean. You probably know Josh McDowell. Sean is his son. Sean is now a leading Christian apologist. He was raised by Josh McDowell, who was probably has spoken live to more people on the defense of the Christian faith than anybody in Christian history. He's spoken to thousands and many thousands of people. But earlier in Sean's life, he came to a point, even though he was raised by this outstanding Christian apologist, he came to a point in his own life as, do I believe these things? Are these things true? And he had to struggle through that himself, and then eventually, of course, himself became a Christian apologist. So doubt is a thing that we see in Scripture, and we see it in our Christian experiences. And one of the questions that I asked as I think about doubt is, I think, well, what does God think about doubters? And how does God deal with doubters in the Bible? And I found kind of two different patterns of how God deals with doubters in the Bible. So there are some people in the Bible who are doubting, who it seems like in the situation God has given them all the evidence they need. There's just no reason for doubting because God has already given them everything they need. So one is the incident about the bread in Matthew 15 and 16. So you have earlier in Matthew, you have the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And then in chapter 16, Jesus and the disciples are going somewhere, and Jesus makes a comment to them about the leaven of the Pharisees. And the disciples remember, oh, we forgot to bring bread. And so they're talking about themselves, well, what he's really meaning, he's rebuking us for not bringing bread. And Jesus says to them, what's your problem? You saw me feed 5,000, and then you saw me feed 4,000. Why are you worried about bread? He wasn't even talking about bread. He was talking about the teaching of the Pharisees, or the scribes, I mean. So he was talking about the teaching of the scribes. He wasn't even bringing up, but in their minds they were doubting whether or not they would have enough bread to eat, right? And Jesus rebukes them because you've got all the evidence you need, folks. Quit your worrying, right? So that's a classic example. And then the other classic example I like to think about is Peter walking on water. So here's a guy, Jesus is coming to them. They have seen Jesus do countless miracles. Peter calls out to Jesus and says, if you command me to come to you, and Jesus commands him, he gets out of the boat, he's walking on water. He's doing what Jesus did. And then suddenly he doubts and he begins to sink. And so Jesus pulls him out of the drink, helps him back into the boat, and then Jesus says to him, why did you doubt, O you of little faith? And so one of the things I think is there are situations in our life when there's just absolutely no reason for doubt. Okay, we have all the evidence that we need, and God's given us all the evidence that we need. But what strikes me here also is that even though God reproves the individuals in these situations, he's still pretty gentle about it. You know, I mean, he doesn't hammer on Peter. You know, he doesn't lecture him for 20 minutes about doubting. He just says, "Why did you doubt, O you of little faith?" Right? And also the thing about the bread. Just a gentle reminder. Listen, guy, you've got all the evidence you need. You know, you don't need any more evidence. You don't need to worry about bread anymore. Right? And then there are situations in the Bible where it seems like, given the situation, that people really do need more information, right? So, for example, John the Baptist in prison. So he's in prison, he sends and he asks for more evidence. And for whatever reason, there's no reprimand there. There's no correction there. There's nothing, you know, well, John, earlier you said, what's your problem? There's none of that. Jesus just sends the disciples back with the evidence, right? And then there's Abraham. So he's already encountered God several times. God's spoken to him, but he's still struggling with this idea of the land and the promise of the land. He's been there now for several years, and he has no evidence of the fulfillment of the promise. And God doesn't rebuke him, but God just gives him some instructions of what to do, and he enters into a covenant with Abraham. So I see God responding in a couple different ways, depending on what we should know, what evidence he's already given us and what things we already know. But the thing that strikes me is that in either situation, God seems to be very patient with us when we doubt. So what are the things that trigger doubt in our lives? At first I was inclined to say, what are the things that cause doubt? But I don't think there's anything that causes doubt. Because when you talk about things causing doubt, it gives the idea that we're kind of helpless in it. It just happens to us, right? And I don't think that's the case, right? But there are some things that trigger doubt, and one of them, the first one, is just unanswered questions, right? So just intellectual questions that we might have about, the existence of God, or what about the people who have never heard, or is the Bible reliable? Those kind of intellectual questions come up, and they may trigger doubt in our mind. The second thing is what we might call unbelievable claims or miracles, right? So, and the Bible, of course, is full of those. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I'm reading the Bible and I read some of those miracles and I go, really? Really? Jesus walking on water, I can almost, it's pretty easy for me to, for whatever reason, accept that Jesus healed a blind man or helped a lame man walk, but come on, walking on water or ascending into heaven, And so there are these kind of seemingly unbelievable claims that might cause us to doubt. And then another thing that causes us to doubt is unresolved crises. Okay, so that would be personal crises in our life. Something tragic happens in our life. The death of a parent if you're a young person, or the death of a child, or some kind of debilitating injury or illness that just wipes you out and you can't work anymore, and you go, God, why? And sometimes those personal crises can trigger doubt. And then just more generally, the whole problem of evil and suffering. It is most Christian apologists will tell you that the problem of evil and suffering is the most common objection to Christianity. And so that's one of the triggers. And then the other trigger is an unsubmissive heart. If we have persistent sin in our life, sin that's there and we are unwilling to give it up, we're unwilling to commit it to God, we're unwilling to strive to overcome it, if it's just a persistent sin and we've embraced that sin, that leads to doubt, which ultimately leads to unbelief. Jesus talks about that in John 7. He says, if any man is willing to do his will, he will know of the teaching whether it is from God. So just a willingness to obey God, a willingness to deal with sin in our life is one of the keys to avoiding doubt and to getting victory over doubt. But as I've talked about, doubt can move us towards faith. So if we handle doubt properly, it can actually be an instrument for growth. So Tim Keller says, a faith without doubts is like the human body without some antibodies in it. People who never doubted will find themselves defenseless against tragedy or probing questions of a smart skeptic. I first heard about this quote from Elisa Childers. She does a podcast. She's got a tremendous podcast. She does a lot of tremendous stuff. But in her life, she grew up in a Christian home. She was a Christian musician, famous Christian musician. And she grew up in this very Christianized context. And she never doubted her faith. She just never had any doubts. She never had any reason to question her faith. And then at one point, she got into a church as a young adult. She got into a church that was moving towards so-called progressive Christianity, a more liberal Christianity. And the church was moving, the pastor was moving the church in that direction. And she got hit with, as she puts it, these probing questions from a smart skeptic, right? And she had no idea what to do with them. And she was totally thrown off her game, so to speak, in her faith for quite some time before she finally figured out how to deal with these things. And so the point that she makes, that Keller makes, and that she was making in her podcast, is that doubts in our lives that we've dealt with properly produce antibodies, right? So once we've had the experience of confronting doubts and hearing questions and answering those questions and wrestling with questions, once we have some experience at that, we are to some degree more resistant to the impact of doubts than we would be before, for a couple reasons. One is we've got answers to our questions. We've doubted, we've gone, we've found the answers, and they've been satisfactory. But the other reason is because we've learned a habit of how to deal with doubt, right? So that raises the question then, how do we deal with doubt? And I would suggest that there are at least 8 different things that we can do, and I wouldn't call these steps because I don't think they come in any particular order. I don't even think they're necessarily that I've listed them here necessarily in any order of priority. I think depending on what you're doubting and how intensely you're doubting, and how and the significance of the doubt. Various ones of these steps may be more important than others. But the first thing I think to do, that I have on the list here at least, is to talk to God about doubt. So one of the things that happens when we doubt is we tend to draw away from God, right? We tend to kind of go, well, I'm not being spiritual. I'm in sin or something because I'm doubting, and so God won't listen to me, or God doesn't want to talk to me, or whatever. And so I think we just need to, one of the things we need to do is to learn to talk to God about our doubts. And if you read the Bible, you see that over and over again, people talking to God about their doubts. Take the father of the demon-possessed. Lord, help my unbelief, Or take the psalmist over and over and over again in the psalmist. We see the psalmist struggling with questions he has no answers to, and going to God with those questions, right? So God understands our doubts. He's not intimidated by them. So if I go to God and I just unload, I go, God, I can't quite handle this, God. I can't process this. He's not intimidated by that. It doesn't scare him. He's not afraid that our doubts are going to overthrow his sovereignty, right? And then the other thing about doubt, about praying about doubt, is even if we're not getting answers to our doubts right away, just praying about it sometimes can give us peace in our doubts, so we're not as troubled by them. The doubt is still there, but I've prayed about it, and so I know it's in God's hands and I don't have to worry about it. It's still there, I still think about it, but I just have more peace about it because I prayed about it. The second thing is to fill our minds with the Word of God. Right. So one of the common responses to doubt is it pulls us away from the Bible. We go, well, how can I read the Bible if I have doubts about whether it's true or not? Well, I read a lot of stuff I don't know whether it's true or not, right? And so that's one of the things Satan wants to do when doubts come in our mind. He wants to get us to quit praying, and he wants us to quit reading our Bibles, right? And those are the exact things we need to do when we're doubting. Even if we have doubts about some aspects of the Bible and whether or not it's true, it still is effective and helpful to read because the Word of God itself is living and active. And so if we read the Word of God, it's the dynamic of the Holy Spirit using it can help in our lives, even in the midst of our doubts. The third thing that I list there is to getting counsel and encouragement from others. So going to others to get counsel, to get encouragement, and to the degree that they can, to give you answers. And many times they can, okay? Just don't try to go it alone. That's one of a thing we commonly do when we're doubting is we're ashamed to tell anybody about it, right? So we don't want to tell anybody, so we try to solve it all on our own. But Ecclesiastes says, woe to the man who falls when there is not another to lift him up. So we just need others, right? And we need other people who will listen to our doubts, who aren't afraid of our doubts, and who may have answers for us to help us answer our doubts. But I want to give you a word of caution here. Is there are a lot of people out there, particularly a lot of Christians, as we said, who are afraid of doubts. And so if you start talking to somebody, you have some doubts, you start talking to somebody who has doubts, or excuse me, who is afraid of doubts, and you start getting that kind of reaction, just stop. People who are afraid of doubts are not going to be able to help you with your doubts, right? But there are plenty of Christians out there, mature Christians, who aren't afraid of doubts and who will listen to your doubts and help you with your doubts. So don't try to get help from somebody who's afraid of doubt. And then you just need to do the hard work of getting the answers, right? And one of the things we need to keep in mind is there's really nothing new under the sun, right? So virtually every question we have has been asked thousands of times before over the last 2 millennia, and Christians have been answering those questions. And there have been many Christians who have been answering them very well. That's why at the beginning of our class several weeks ago, I gave you a handout of all those books, a couple hundred books or so, and there's many, many more than that, right? Because Christians have been answering these questions for a long time. So there is help out there, there are resources out there, there's information out there to help you with your doubts. And then I think this is a tremendous point. I never thought of it this way before, but when I read about it, I thought, oh yeah, I do that sometimes, is doubt your doubts. Okay, so Keller says the only way to doubt Christianity rightly and fairly is to discern the alternate belief under each of your doubts, and then to ask yourself what reasons you have for believing it. So for example, I go, well, did God really create the universe? Well, what's the alternative to God creating the universe? Well, it popped into existence out of nothing. Okay, so if those are my alternatives, God created the universe, or it just popped into existence out of nothing, I got a lot of reason to doubt that. Things don't just pop into existence out of nothing, right? We've never seen that happen. Okay, some people will take the evidence, various evidences for the resurrection, like the empty tomb and the eyewitness reports of the disciples, and most historians accept those. Most even secular and atheist historians accept those evidences as existent, that those things really happened. There was an empty tomb. The disciples really thought they saw the living Jesus. Okay, they accept those things as being true. They just try to give them a different explanation, right? So the question is, what's the best explanation? Is the best explanation Jesus really did rise from the dead, and the tomb was empty, and the disciples really saw him? Or is the best explanation they were hallucinating or whatever? So what I need to do is I need to doubt my doubts. And in addition to doubting my faith, I need to doubt my doubts. And we'll go into this in much more detail in coming lessons. But there are methods and strategies for looking at two competing hypotheses and determining which one is the best, right? And one we most often use, although we don't do it many times don't do it very well, but it can be done very well, is called inference to the best explanation. This is the way most people try to figure out which one of two competing explanations is the better explanation. Another more technical approach is called Bayes' theorem, and we'll go into that a little bit in a future lesson. But these are ways that we can look at competing explanations and try and weigh them out. Number 6 is keep things in balance. And so one recommendation is don't ignore your doubts. So sometimes those doubts just kind of hang there and we don't deal with them, we just ignore them. But what we have to remember is what Conway says, is that doubt is going somewhere. And so if I've got a doubt there and I'm not dealing with it, it's probably going to lead me towards unbelief, right? But on the other hand, I don't want to obsess about my doubts, right? I don't want to become so obsessed that that's all I can think about is about my doubts. Conway says doubt is like an attention-demanding child. You got a kid who just constantly wants your attention. That's what doubts are often like. And so what we need to learn to do is we need to get some balance in our life. When doubts arise, we need to say, okay, that's a doubt. I recognize it's a doubt. I need to deal with that doubt, but I'm not going to let it control my life. So I put it over here. I pray about it. I read. I try to find answers. But it's not the only thing I think about. I don't let it just absolutely consume me. The 7th thing is remember things you already know. And one of the things about doubt, and I don't know if you've noticed this, I certainly have in my life, is doubts have a way of coming up. I deal with them. They go away and I go, okay, that's settled. And then a couple of years later, a few years later, or sometime like, bing, it pops up again, right? Here I am, I'm still here. And you know all those answers that you got the last time, they don't work anymore, right? Well, they do work. The answers that resolved your doubt in the first place, in most cases, are still just as valid now as they were 2 years ago or 5 years ago, whenever you dealt with that last. So just remember what you already know, right? And then also remember, once you've had experience dealing with doubt, and I do this all the time, some question or some doubt pops in my mind, and I just go, oh, there's another one. Well, I've had bunches of these before, and God has answered all of them. So I'm pretty confident He's got an answer for this one too, right? God's got a pretty good track record, at least in my life, of answering my questions and my doubts. And so when a new one pops up, I just remember, okay, I don't have the answer for here, but He's answered an awful lot of questions. You know, I encountered a verse in the Bible the other day in my devotional time. Verse I've read many times before, and it wasn't a doubt question, but it was just a question. It came up, and I've never had the answer for it. And it came up again, and this time when I read the passage, and I went. So when I was out walking and praying about it later, I said, Lord, you know, I've never really gotten an answer to this question. I never even asked Him for an answer to the question. You know, it's just been one that was out there. And I just said, Lord, will you answer that question? I don't know how many times I've done that in my life, and sometime down the road, sometimes very soon, and sometimes several years later, God gives me a good answer to that question. Well, it's the same way with our doubts. And then finally, at some point, you just have to decide. You got to make a choice, right? Joshua says, choose you this day whom you will serve. So when I've dealt with doubt, when I've looked for the answers, and I've got the alternatives here, I've gone through these various steps, then at some point, I need to make a decision. We are not at the mercy of our doubts. Okay? We ultimately are in control of what we believe. So when I have a doubt, I deal with the doubt, I think through it, I pray through it, I read through it, I get help from others, I remember how God has done things in the past and how He's answered I do all those things, and at some point I have to go, okay, I need to plant my flag. I need to decide this is where I stand, right? And finally, ultimately do that. But that might take some time. Well, we're about out of time. Just a couple comments on helping others who doubt. Jude says, show mercy on those who are doubting. So a lot of our whole class this year is going to be about helping people who doubt, right? Well, James tells us in doing that we need to show mercy. We of course need to be patient. We've already talked about how we need to honor their questions. We want to be able to provide them with answers. And to people who have an ongoing struggle with doubt, we can help them through some of these 8 things that I've just suggested, 8 things that we can do in dealing with doubt. Okay? So next week, we're going to start our lessons on epistemology. We're going to just build a foundation about knowledge. How do we know things? What is knowledge? How do we get it? Is it possible to have true knowledge? That sort of thing. And we'll go on and we'll explore some about the relationship between knowledge and belief or faith and that sort of thing. So that's where we're headed next week. So any questions or comments or heckling or anything? So.